Hi everyone, Professor King here. In this video, I'm going to be talking about humanities level research, specifically how to perform historical and biographical research, both on your own and using our college's library website. So it's a good idea to be taking notes and probably, screenshots or something of that nature to help you access some of these URLs that I'll be sharing with you. And it's also a helpful way to think about the types of research you can do going forward in future essays for this class and for any class, really. This continues some of the PowerPoint slides that we started when we talked about theoretical and intertextual research. So if it looks familiar, that's why. It's just been a little bit of time since the last time we covered this set of slides. So without further ado, I'll take it to the share screen. This is going to be a pretty straightforward video since we have so many other things going on this week. Go through. We already did intertextual research. So here we start at historical research. So what is historical research? Well, it's research that helps students to understand and interpret the past by examining and interpreting evidence and sources, okay? I think historical research as it applies to the play M. Butterfly is very helpful because one, I've provided an example on our Canvas page for you, which is the Wadler article, The True Story of M. Butterfly, as well as Huang's afterword to the play. In that afterward, he discusses kind of specific historical happenings and phenomena that are going on and why he decided to utilize some of that context when crafting this play. So if we know about the past, if we know about the time period in which something happened, we can get a better understanding of the nuances of the play, of perhaps motivation of the characters, of things like plot and theme, maybe even things like satire and allegory as they relate to the time of either the playwright or the time in which the story takes place, okay? And so those two pieces, the Wadler article broadly and kind of the afterword to a lesser extent, those are going to give us some really helpful context with which to look at this play. Again, historical research is just one way of doing research, but if history is something that interests you, it's a really kind of cool way that you can look at a text. Historical research also helps you, the student, to provide context and precedents for what's being studied, okay? So for example, in M. Butterfly, ask yourself the following questions in terms of the historical research you might want to do. What do we learn about the real life people on which the characters of Song and Guillemard are based? Because they are based on people from, French and Chinese history, contemporary history. What do we learn about them? What do we learn about the histories of those cultures, and particularly espionage, right? Because this is kind of a story about espionage in one sense, right? What about other, sort of cultural mores or values or belief systems, right? Like if we have this sort of taboo subject of gender and sexuality going on in this play, or at least taboo for its time, why might kind of finding out more about the history and the geography of these places be important? What's similar or different from real life to text? If we think about writers, somebody like David Henry Hwang, right? And how they adapt real life into their writing to various extents, depending on who the writer is. Why do you think they pick and choose what they pick and choose to craft their narrative, right? Like, why change this element of a character or of a setting, or why bring in the discussion of this, or sort of highlight a discussion of one thing and bring to the background the discussion of another? Like, in other words, what are they trying to get us to think, see, feel, or believe by doing that? Why might Huang have decided to make those changes? Again, what's he trying to make us think, see, feel, or believe? Because you can't include everything, right? It's not a one-to-one ratio. So you have to pick those things that you you want to share in your narrative to get your point across. And then how does this affect the audience? How does it inform our reading of the play? Because again, when we think about like the rhetorical triangle, we have to consider how a text is affected by and affects not only its creator, not only its audience, but the purpose, right? When one of those things changes, all the other ones change. So let's consider that in terms of, setting up a historical context through which we view the work. In historical research, you'll have primary sources and you'll have secondary sources, right? Primary sources are firsthand information of the time period and place being studied. So these will be things like actual diary entries or personal letters or newspaper clippings from the time period in which the story takes place, okay, in which the narrative takes place. So in other words, it gives us that immediacy, that sort of like this time in history, this is what's going on kind of a thing, right? Secondary sources, on the other hand, are like one removed, right? Where primary sources are texts or pieces of information from the time and place in which the narrative occurs. Secondary sources are kind of one removed, or even further, right? So you'll have things like historians and other credible researchers' interpretations or analyses of these events. In other words, like these aren't people who are living at the same time period. They're kind of looking back, right, through a secondary lens of history to critique these events, right? So things like biographies, scholarly journal articles, and news articles that are reflecting on a certain time period, right? They're not published at the time or around the time. They're published much later, kind of reflecting on those times. Those would be examples of secondary sources, okay? But make sure whether you're using primary or secondary sources, you're verifying the validity of any research you come across, especially if you encounter inconsistencies. Even though misleading information abounds in the internet age, right? Or limited information or biased information, even though that's all running willy-nilly right now, this is not the first time that that kind of information has been shared. So no matter what kind of research you do, always verify it, right? Always make sure that it passes muster, so that it's useful in an academic setting or environment, right? It's not just a Google article or something like that. So some helpful links that you might want to check out. The first one is an independent website called archive.org, and archive.org is really cool because it gives you these primary source documents from very specific time periods that you would be looking for. So let me see if I click on it, if it'll take us to archive.org. So this is archive.org. I just want you to be careful when you go on it because there's two search engines that are like right next to each other, and you want to avoid the top one. The Wayback Machine is like this like kind of very limited video cache of things. So avoid the Wayback Machine. You want to come down here to the Internet Archive because as you see, it's got all kinds of texts and media, right? It's got audio, it's got images, it's got film, books, articles, what have you, web pages. So let's say you want to research, Vietnam is mentioned in this text, and one of the questions I asked in another video is like, why do you think they're talking about Vietnam when this takes place, in China? So you might want to do like Vietnam, 1950s, 1960s, because we're going to the historical time period, in which this takes place, right? So then we have these historical documents that you can look at, right? This is a little different than the library website in that you don't necessarily always get like an abstract that tells you what it is, but you can go through it. You see like some of them are audio files, some of them are print files, some of them are reports. You know, some of them come from like the government. Some of them are secondary sources, right? Like kind of looking back on some of these things. So again, all of these different types of sources on Vietnam in the 50s and 60s, right? So you can play around with and if you're just like a history nerd and or buff, I guess I should say, and you want to find out more about like a specific, you know, genre or something like that, you can always just have fun with it, right? Like, let's say you wanted to do like, I don't know, 90s freestyle, right? That's making a comeback. So then you get all sorts of like songs or flyers or different radio stations, right? Like some of these are present today and they're throwbacks. Some of them are from the time period. You know, all kinds of different things, remixes, right? Like, so it just depends on like historically what the thing you're researching is. And you'll get any number of different types. And you can limit the types too, like text, TV, radio, archive websites. So if you don't want to, if you're like, I don't want to go through a bunch of audio files, right? Like you can limit it. You don't have to do the metadata. The metadata is just everything. You can also go to the library catalog for bibliography, for biographies. Go here, and then that'll help you to perform a catalog search, right? So let's say like Jean Gaimard, if anything shows up. All kinds of stuff. It's in French, right? And it's not what we're looking for, but you know, play around with the keywords a little bit. And then you have America's historical newspapers from 1690 to 2000. This one's kind of interesting. This is actually a link on our library website. Uh-oh. I don't know why it asked for a username. Let me see. I guess it's not working. Oh well. If you go to our library website and you put in the white box America's historical newspapers, that database will show up. So that's another one you can use. That gives those primary newspaper articles from the time periods you want to look at. So something to think about. So that's historical research. Now we're going to move on to biographical research, because again, we're talking about real life people on whom these characters are based, but we also have an author of this text that we could do some biographical research on. You know, if you want to kind of, again, thumb your nose at T.S. Eliot and say the author does matter, right? So biographical research, it constitutes the study of a single life, right? And I would just say that the professional field broadly conceived, because it's not necessarily education that we're looking at, right? So it's the study of a single life, someone who is affiliated with the field of study that you're looking at, right? So if we're talking about M. Butterfly, that could be David Henry Hwang and a biography of him. That could be a biography of B.D. Wong and John Lithgow, who were the first actors to play these characters when it debuted on Broadway, right? If you want to look at the Broadway rendition of it. It could be, you know, the real life people on whom Gaimard and Song are based, right? So it can go any number of ways as long as some of it's based in reality, right? So yeah. It can also include life history writing, oral history, memoir, autobiography, and life narrative. And let's talk about that a little bit, because that's just kind of repeated here. Because some of those are going to be more accurate than others, and I'll explain how and why, okay? You can have scholarly chronicles which kind of chronicle the scholarly output of a writer. So for example, like in our theory textbook, the beginning parts where they go over, like, for example, like, we're not reading Hegel in this class, you're welcome. But, you know, with Hegel at the beginning, they give us that scholarly biography of Hegel. They talk a little bit about his personal life, but it's mostly centering on his output as a scholar, right? His intellectual biography, in other words, right? It's not about like when he was 4 and his mom didn't feed him Oreos that one time, right? I don't even think Oreos existed in Hegel's time, but who knows? It's not about that. It's about like a biography of their work in the field, so to speak, right? So those can be helpful because those serve as these sort of not just biographies, but bibliographies of the writer's work that we can then go to and do some intertextual research, reading some of the other works that they've put out and compare that to what we're seeing in front of us, right? We also have life history writing, right, which is kind of looking at specific groups of people or populations that existed in a certain setting, geographic setting at a certain time in history, right? Where we want to be wary is in memoir and autobiography, because think of it this way, right? A person who writes their own autobiography is going to be biased most of the time in presenting themselves a certain way, right? In presenting certain things and leaving out others conspicuously for specific reasons, right? So always take autobiographies or memoirs with a grain of salt, because while they can be accurate and reliable, again, you are getting that information about that life from the person whose life it is. And you might say like, oh, wouldn't that be like the most reliable form of information? Well, think of it this way. Who has a more objective view of who you are? You living your life day in and day out with your brain, or someone who might be once or twice removed from you? So just take it with a grain of salt, right? And sometimes people write autobiographies. I mean, people write all kinds of things for loaded reasons, but sometimes they write them to kind of, you know, get back at an ex-lover or to set the record straight about some mishap or, you know, their purpose in writing is sometimes a little skewed, which skews the factuality of the autobiography. So just be careful. And then we have narrative biographies. These are exceptionally helpful when they're written by scholars, by people who kind of spend their life's work and study, you know, on a particular subject, because they really care about sort of getting all the information they can. But if it's just for sort of salacious purposes, like to sell books and get on the New York Times bestseller list and kind of spread gossip about a particular person, like that's not necessarily the most reliable narrative biography. So you want people who, you know, who again have credibility, who have credentials, who have objectivity, who do a lot of research. You want to look at their work, right? And why choose biographical research? Well, it, you know, it's kind of to, again, thumb your nose at people like, you know, Roland Barthes and T.S. Eliot. It's to provide insight into the motivations and knowledge a writer utilizes when constructing a text, right? All of us are sort of these aggregates of our own personal experiences. And so that would have to play a role in the text we create, one would think, right? So it can help us think about those motivations, that knowledge, the purpose for constructing the text, the purpose for engaging in the behavior that is then converted to an artistic text, et cetera, et cetera. Also, biographical research provides context for the reader when reading a text, right? If I know more about David Henry Hwang, if I know more about the real life people on whom his characters are based, then I'm going to have a richer context, and I'm going to be able to look at the play through more lenses than I had before, right? But one thing you don't ever want to do is you don't want to insert the author into the text as a character, right? Even when it's really, really tempting to do so. Um, you know, so with like fantasy novels, it's easy, right? Like George R.R. Martin is clearly not Khaleesi, right? But sometimes when we deal with more realistic fiction, people really have trouble differentiating between the author and the protagonist or narrator, right? One story I teach is James Baldwin's Sonny's Blues. And the main character, or really the narrator in that, is an algebra teacher whose brother suffers from addiction. And so when students write on the essay, inevitably I'll get several who say like when Baldwin's brother goes through his heroin addiction, and I say, no, right? Like Baldwin is not the narrator. The narrator is this character in this universe that Baldwin created in his head, right? But sometimes they see that personal eye and they think, oh, well, that must be the author, right? That is not the case, right? And so when we're doing biographical research, we have to make sure to keep that same delineation, right? To keep that same boundary and separateness, that the author is not the character in the play, right? The character is a creation of that author's imaginative landscape, right? And so that, I said it was going to be short and sweet, and it is. So that gives us historical and biographical research. Again, as we continue to write in this class, as you continue to write in other classes, these are forms of research that you can then engage in that will help you to understand not just literary texts, but any number of texts in a richer way. So I hope this helped. I will take it off share screen now. As I always say, message me if you have any questions. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your days. See you in cyberspace. Bye-bye.